Hi, I'm Terry. I'm going to show you my easier way to making my kefir. Seen lots of videos where people are out there and they're using strainers and they're going crazy, doing all this work trying to separate their grains. Doesn't really take that much. So here's kefir. It's been fermenting for about 18 hours. And as you can see, if you look in here, look at the bottom, you'll see it started to separate. It's a nice thick kefir, just separating. That's the time you want to take it out. When people say you go 24 hours, it all depends on the temperature. Lots of mine, in the summertime, it was only taking 8 to 12 hours. Sometimes it'll separate and get into very thick curds, but most of the time it's pretty easy. So here's my approach. You've seen people, they talk about not using metal or whatever, but doing it, metal doesn't really make much difference. But rather than straining it and going through all that effort, I just take my next jar. I generally alternate back and forth between 2 or 3 of them. Then I take my kefir. I just go in there with a fork and I move it around and I grab my large kefir grain. As you can see, mine's pretty large. And I just toss it into the next jar. Just to make sure it hasn't dropped any little pieces, I'll look around a little bit, see if I can grab anything else, and then I just take my milk, pour it in, and it's kefir. So, much simpler. Very little muss and fuss. This I will often add other items and make a second ferment. Sometimes I'll just use it like this. You can also strain it if you want to make really thick Greek-style yogurt, which I'll show you in just a minute. But I also like to make a version where I strain it. As I said before, I don't always use a strainer because it makes a mess, but it's Saturdays or Sundays, so I have time. So what I do is I take a simple coffee filter, paper coffee filter, on bleach. Stick it in my strainer. You pour the kefir in, and nice and chunky, however thick it is. It can be pretty thin, and this will still work out. And then as it strains, the whey will drip through. If I want to be aggressive, I could go in there with a spoon, but if I'm just being, I have other things to do with my time, I just let it sit like this, and after 3 or 4 hours, I'll have a very thick Greek-style yogurt. After about 8 hours, I will have something thick enough to make cream cheese out of, where you can add fruits and stuff to it, or today what I want to do is add basil and oregano and garlic and make a spread to go with vegetables. So very thick kefir cheese, also very easy. The only time I bother using the strainer, otherwise I just go with the fork method to pull things out. So here I have a jar. I fermented it for a day. Then I separated out the grains. In this case, you can see little dots in here. This is green because I had I put in 2 kiwis, blended it on high in my blender with a bit of Konjac root. You can sort of see this jar now has about 500 milliliters in it. I'm going to take off the lid. So it's been second fermenting now for about 12 hours. And we're going to watch how much it expands. So it's already gone up by at least 200 milliliters. And if I let it sit here a little bit, because now the pressure's off of it. The pressure was keeping the gases in the kefir. As it gets to set at just air pressure, it's going to continue to grow a little bit. It's slow, but it'll grow up to probably around 750 milliliters total. Might already be getting close to that. So you have to be a little careful if you don't leave enough room in the jar. You can see when this was under pressure, it was only half full. Now it's 3/4 and maybe a little bit even fuller. As I showed in one of the other ones, if you're not careful with that, it can actually dent the lid, blow out, and make a big mess as it's going on. So, but the nice thing about that Konjac root is after you put that in and blend it, it generally doesn't separate much anymore. Unlike using chia seeds, which is what I've used chia seeds, it does get nice and thick, but it doesn't get as fluffy, and it'll still separate a little bit. With these Konjac root, I've not had a reseparation, and it makes it much foamier more like a mousse. And as you can see now, the jar is almost completely full, even though it was only half full before. That's because the gas is expanding inside the kefir, but the konjac root provides such a nice structure in terms of its fiber that it keeps it all together. So in the end, we get a nice, very fluffy kefir. I was showing you that it's thick. Second ferment can sometimes be a little powerful, escape from the jar. So I try and loosen this up. You'll see the fermentation has produced the foam with the konjac root in there that's actually so powerful it just dented the lid, but it made a nice, really thick, foamy mousse-like kefir. That's super thick. It'll stay on the fork, even upside down. It's not going to drip off. But I filled the jar too full. I should have left the jar down about here. Instead, I filled it much closer to the top, and as it fermented and got foamy, it grew and actually destroyed the lid on this one.